Everyone knows the story of Atlantis, a hyper-advanced utopian civilization swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. For thousands of years, explorers have desperately searched the bottom of the ocean for it. But what if I told you that the story of Atlantis wasn't a myth at all? What if it was a real, thriving metropolis, a literal superpower of the ancient world that actually was wiped off the map overnight? In the winter of 373 BC, one of the most powerful cities in ancient Greece suffered a catastrophe so violent it shocked the ancient world and changed the course of history. The city's name wasn't Atlantis, it was Helike, and for over 2,000 years it was completely lost. Today, we're going to uncover exactly how a Greek superpower vanished beneath the waves, how it inspired the greatest legend in human history, and how two rogue archaeologists finally found it, buried right under dry land. To understand the sheer magnitude of this disaster, you have to understand what exactly was lost. You see, Helike wasn't just some quaint coastal fishing village. Founded all the way back in the Mycenaean period, this city rose to become the undisputed capital of the 12 cities of ancient Achaia. It was an absolute cultural and economic powerhouse. In fact, Helike was so wealthy and influential that it even expanded its empire across the Mediterranean, founding its own incredibly famous colonies in Italy, like the legendary city of Sybaris in the 8th century BC. But above all else, Helike was famous for its religious devotion. The city was the supreme epicenter for the worship of Poseidon Heliconius. To the ancient Greeks, Poseidon wasn't just the god of the sea, he was, crucially, the god of earthquakes. And here is the dark, tragic irony of this entire story. The citizens of Helike literally minted their own coinage, featuring the striking head of Poseidon on one side and his signature trident on the other. They poured their vast wealth into building a massive pan-Hellenic sanctuary dedicated entirely to the Earthshaker. They truly believed that by honoring him so lavishly, they would be granted his divine protection. Helike was a crown jewel of the Greek world. Located on the southwest shore of the Gulf of Corinth, it was a bustling hub of trade, philosophy, and religion. Imagine a city filled with bronze statues, grand temples, and sprawling marketplaces. But their wealth and devotion to the god of the sea couldn't stop what was brewing beneath their feet, because Helike sat directly on top of one of the most active tectonic fault lines in Europe. According to ancient accounts, 5 days before the disaster, something incredibly strange happened. A mass exodus began in the streets. But it wasn't the humans leaving, it was the animals. Mice, snakes, centipedes, and insects began fleeing the city en masse, abandoning their nests and heading straight for the high ground of the mountains. The citizens watched this bizarre phenomenon, completely confused, but they didn't evacuate. They stayed right where they were, unaware that the earth beneath them was about to unleash absolute hell. On a cold winter night in 374 BC, the Helike fault line violently ruptured. Try to imagine the sheer force of this quake. The massive stone structures of the ancient world had no flexibility. Buildings collapsed instantly, violently crushing thousands of citizens in their sleep before they even knew what was happening. But the shaking earth was only the first wave of destruction. Out in the blackness of the Gulf, the tremendous seismic shock triggered massive underwater landslides. In response, the sea rapidly retreated, aggressively pulling water out of the Gulf of Corinth. Then, a massive tsunami roared back toward the shattered shore. But this wasn't just a wave that crashed and then receded back into the ocean. The sheer violence of the shaking caused the ground to undergo severe liquefaction, meaning the land itself had literally dropped. The solid earth turned to mud, and the entire coastal plain sank rapidly into an inland lagoon. The sea swallowed the city whole. When the sun rose the next morning, Helike was gone. It didn't just burn, it didn't just fall, it was wiped from the face of the earth. A Spartan fleet of 10 ships that had been anchored in the harbor was completely obliterated. Where a bustling metropolis stood just hours before, there was now only a murky, churning lagoon. The only thing left visible were the tops of the trees in Poseidon's sacred grove, poking through the surface of the water.
News of Helike's apocalyptic end sent shockwaves throughout the ancient Mediterranean, and just 13 years after the city sank, the famous philosopher Plato sat down to write two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. In those texts, the world was introduced to a story for the very first time, the story of Atlantis. Now, I want to be clear here. While the magical utopian Atlantis that Plato described is a myth, most historians agree that Plato used the very real, very fresh trauma of Helike as the blueprint for his story. He took a real-life catastrophe and elevated it into a timeless allegory. But Helike wasn't just an inspiration for ancient literature. For centuries after the disaster, Helike was actually a major tourist attraction. It became one of the world's first sites for ancient dark tourism. When the Greek philosopher Eratosthenes visited the site roughly 150 years later, local ferrymen told him incredible stories about what lay beneath their boats. They claimed you could look down into the water and see a massive bronze statue of Poseidon still standing upright beneath the water. Centuries later, by the 2nd century AD, the traveler Pausanias noted that the ruins were still visible under the lagoon. But nature wasn't finished. Eventually, river sediments and mud silted the lagoon over completely. The water receded, replaced entirely by solid ground. Helike vanished from sight, and eventually from memory. For almost 2 millennia, Helike was considered a ghost story, until a modern-day treasure hunt changed everything. Fast forward to the 1950s, when a man named Spyridon Marinatas entered the picture. He was the Director General of Antiquities for Greece, and he was absolutely obsessed with finding Helike. He believed that because the city was swallowed instantly by mud and water, it would be the ultimate time capsule, even better preserved than Pompeii. But there was a massive problem. Marinatos spent decades, from 1950 to 1973, dragging sonar equipment through the deep waters of the Corinthian Gulf, entirely convinced that the city was resting somewhere on the ocean floor. And after all that time, effort, and money, he found absolutely nothing. The mystery went cold until a new guard took over in 1988. Enter Greek archaeologist Dora Katsonokoulou and American physicist Stephen Soter. Together, they officially launched the Helike project. Initially, they also failed to find any marine evidence out in the ocean, but then they had a massive geological realization. Over thousands of years, river sediment had washed down from the mountains and completely filled in the ancient lagoon. Helike wasn't in the sea anymore. It was buried under solid, dry land. This realization kicked off an agonizing process of systematically drilling boreholes into the coastal plain, pulling up tubes of earth to search the mud. It took years of drilling blind, but in 1995, they got their first major clue. Excavations at a site called Rhizomilis uncovered a large Roman building. This was the very first concrete proof of habitation on the coastal plain since the search began. They were getting incredibly close. Finally, in 2001, after 12 grueling years of searching the mud, they struck gold. Well, technically they struck ancient coins and classical walls. They had finally uncovered the classical city of Helike, perfectly preserved in ancient lagoon mud. They had found the real Atlantis. But the story doesn't end there, because there was one final mind-bending twist waiting for them. As the team dug deeper beneath the 373 BC ruins, they found something even more shocking: an early Bronze Age town dating all the way back to 2400 BC. This much older town had also been destroyed by a massive earthquake, and it too was submerged in a lagoon. That means this ancient settlement suffered the exact same apocalyptic fate a full 2,000 years before classical Helike met its end.
The story of Helike is a humbling reminder of nature's sheer power. A city can conquer its neighbors, build the grandest temples, and mint its own immense wealth, but in the end, the Earth always has the final say. Today, the Helike project continues to painstakingly excavate this incredible time capsule, pulling the real Atlantis out of the mud, piece by piece. Now I turn the question over to you. If you were an archaeologist, where in the world would you most want to dig? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into lost ancient history, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.